All right, we're live and folks are coming in now.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'll just wait just a few seconds for people to get in and situated here. I'm really excited about today's program on composting. I was just talking about my lazy composting ways, and I probably need to learn how to do it a little bit better. All right. So, hi, I'm Vanessa with the Dallas Public Library. Sorry, I don't have my camera on today. I don't have the best of internet. Just a few housekeeping things today. You will be muted during the meeting. However, if you have any questions for Lauren, our presenter, you can put those in the chat. And we'll have a break about halfway through the presentation to ask them on the first half of the presentation, and then we'll have another question session at the end. You can ask those. Just so you know, this is being recorded. So if you do not want to appear, you can go ahead and turn off your camera. And let's see, let me turn it over to Judy with the Department of Environmental Quality and Sustainability, who's going to introduce our presenter for today.
Hello, everyone, on this continuing to be a rainy day here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But we're so glad you joined us for Grow With Us. It's just such a popular program, and we love presenting it along with the library. They're such terrific partners. We have a wonderful presenter here, just really excited to talk about this. But for a moment, I just want to take a minute. The Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability is where I work, and we focus on a number of different topics. Urban agriculture is one of them. We also focus on, energy, stormwater, water conservation, zero waste, and just a number of things. Also the CCAP, the Comprehensive Environmental Climate Action Plan. It's the first the city has done, the city of Dallas. We're really excited about that plan and how all these different topics and focus areas fit into that. Today we'll be focusing on composting, but one of the things I want to mention is with all this rain, I really encourage you to, even if you have to go out in the rain, pick up after your pets, because the pet waste can generate bacteria and parasites that get into the stormwater that's running into the storm drains. And actually that's our water. It is our water. That's unfiltered water that goes into the drains. It ends up into our area lakes and creeks and ponds and the Trinity River. And so anything we can do to keep any kind of litter, chemicals. So right now is not the time to be putting any kind of chemicals on your lawns. As you all know, I think you all are probably experts or you wouldn't be here, but just a friendly reminder not to do that. Pick up that pest waste, even if it means putting on a hat and getting out there in the rain and picking it up. And we say at least once a week, but I really encourage you to do it a couple of times a week. And we don't recommend it for composting because at home, and Lauren will know a lot more about this, but our compost piles usually don't get hot enough to take out all the bad stuff that could be in there, but you definitely do dispose of it properly. So we really encourage you to do that. It's important. It really helps with water quality overall. So thank you for letting me have that little moment. And now I want to turn to Lauren and talk to you about the fact that this month has been Compost Awareness Month. And actually coming up is Compost Awareness Day. And so she'll be talking more about that. Lauren Clark is the founder of Turn. It's a DFW-based environmental service. She is a certified Dallas Master Gardener and composting specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife and a United States Composting Council certified compost facility operator. And today she is here with us to continue talking to us about composting, the basics of it, the science, and just all the different methodologies and the ways to either get started or continue and improve your composting skills. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Judy. Thank you to the City of Dallas, Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability, and the Dallas Public Library. I am thrilled to be with you all today on this rainy Monday. Thank you so much for joining at the lunch hour. I am here in my kitchen and I will share with you a PowerPoint in just a second. But again, thank you. The goal of this time for me is to make this a fun, informative, educational, and engaging session. So let's get going. And I still see that people are still joining. I'm going to share my screen. And get this going here. Whoops. Here we go. And let's get going. So it's 12:05. My talk is usually about 30 minutes. And I'm going to pause about halfway through. So if you do have some questions, as Vanessa mentioned, start typing them in the chat, and we'll pause about halfway through and I'll try to answer those. And then we'll also have some time at the end for questions and just conversation if you'd like. Again, my name is Lauren Clark. I'm the founder of Turn, and today's class is meant to give you sort of a survey course or an overview of some of the ways that you can compost at home in your own backyards or even in your apartments if you don't have a yard. So let's get going. All right, always have to have an agenda. We're going to talk through what is composting, why is it important, how is it made, when is it ready, how to apply it, and what are the different methods for composting. And I think that you all will probably, hopefully enjoy this. This is me. Judy, thank you so much for the introduction. I came across composting. I've been doing it myself for a long time, but I started this composting business, when I actually realized the problem of food waste. And I realized that problem when I started going to culinary school. So all of this being said, I love gardening. I love food. I even have backyard chickens. So if you have any random questions about those things and how it relates to compost, I'm fair game. No questions are prohibited. I'm a Texas native, was born and raised in Dallas. I have 2 kids at home, again, backyard chickens. So I love talking about composting. Everything that we're going to go through today is something that I have done myself in my own backyard. So I wanted you all to know that I come across this as a pragmatist, as a consumer. Yes, I've done all of this compost training, but my goal is to really get people to do it themselves. So I try to speak about it in a simple way. And also I want to caveat that I do not have a degree in soil science or any of the sciences. I've really just done a deep dive into this until actually the last few years. So there's a chance that I might not know the answer to one of your questions, and I'm totally okay with that. I will take notes and I will follow up with you directly. If I don't know one of the answers, I will find it out. All right. So you all probably know this already, but I always feel like it's nice to start with a simple definition of what is compost. It is the product of organic materials that have decomposed to create a stable soil product that will feed your plants. And if you're a really sophisticated composter, there are 2 different factors of stability, maturity. You all don't really need to worry about that. But essentially you're taking things that you will find outside that are organic and things from your kitchen or your household that are organic, combine those things over time, they will have decomposed, and that product will hopefully feed your plants. Why is it important? Again, I don't want to be too heavy-handed on this because a lot of you probably know why it's important, but we always have to, I think, in life, start with the why about anything. And all of the sources that I'm going to talk about here are listed on our website, www.turncompost.com/why. And there's even more and more sources coming out daily and weekly about the importance of composting to our environment. And I used to do this why over like 5 or 6 slides, and somebody said, you know what, why don't you try to consolidate it into 1 slide? So here we are. I like to think about the why in terms of 3 different pillars or dimensions. And the first and perhaps most important is environmental. The United Nations has said that if food waste are a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere behind China and the US. All right, so when food waste goes into a landfill and it's sitting there and it's not composted, it emits methane, which is a really negative greenhouse gas. And amazingly, approximately 30%, some places even 40%, say that what goes into our landfills is actually organic waste, food waste and yard waste. So composting is a way that we are going to save the environment by reducing those greenhouse gases. I guess I could just go on and on about the problems of food waste. Believe it or not, it's actually the #1 single item in our waste stream. And yet 1 in 7 Americans is food insecure. So, you know, there's some societal issues there as well. So the average US household does generate 650 pounds of compostable materials each year. So composting is a really, really important thing for our environment in a global sense, in a national sense, and even in a local sense. The other reason we should compost is that it's a really important product that can help your soil. Dallas-Fort Worth is such a rapidly growing metroplex, and we're one of the largest in the country, right? And we're all about development and progress. But I also think that perhaps we've also forgotten some of the importance of the soil and the quality of our soil. I like to say that healthy soil makes healthy plants, that makes healthy food, that can in turn help to make healthy people. And compost is just an amazing product that ideally you should be applying regularly to your urban landscape, at least once a year, ideally every growing season. There are numerous benefits to compost. It has a rainbow of macro and micronutrients. It helps to retain water. It helps to prevent erosion. You know, think about the value of water. Of course, it's super rainy right now, but before long, it's going to be really super dry and hot here in Dallas. And water is a precious resource. So compost will help to retain those precious resources of nutrients and moisture in your soil. And it will continually feed your plants with these macro and micronutrients. I do like to point out here that compost is not fertilizer. Fertilizer is meant to replace 1 or 2 missing links in the chain of what might be needed in your plants. But compost, again, has that really beautiful, good compost should have that full spectrum of macro and micronutrients. Compost acts honestly like a sponge in the soil. So, you know, there's just, I could go on and on. I'll stop right there. Again, trying to consolidate the why. All right. The third reason, if I have to convince you why composting is important, perhaps it's because of your wallet. And because compost has so many benefits of retaining moisture and nutrients, think about the money that you might save if you're saving your water, if you're saving on all those expensive fertilizers, if you're saving on those expensive lawn treatments. You know, us Texans, we love our perfect lawns, our perfect grass, and we're willing to spend a lot of money on services to make everything look perfect. I would like to argue that if you're regularly applying compost to your soil and to your urban landscape, you're going to actually be saving money. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now. Hopefully that was convincing to you all. All right. I like to show this slide. It's an image of the soil food web published by the USDA. And the point of this slide is to inspire you of the fact that there is a whole universe beneath our feet. There's so much activity. There's a literal stage of activity happening in our soil, should be happening in our soil. And these cast of characters are here. Some things we can see with our eyes, you know, like the birds and the worms and beetles and things like that are nature's decomposers. But some things we can't see with our own eyes, you can only see with a microscope. And those are the microbial level. Different types of bacteria and fungi are there. All of these things are incredibly important to our soil. And, you know, I like to think that, I like to say that, you know, in America and around the world, we've always had the space race, right? To understand the stars and the planets. And I think that we've often probably underestimated all of the activity that's happening underneath our feet. So check out the Soil Food Web. There's this wonderful woman named Elaine Ingham who has a whole website with Soil Food Web resources. And this is also fun if you're talking about composting for kids. This is a really fun slide to think about. So moving on, how is compost made? Okay, now here we're going to kind of get into the basic science of composting. And once you learn about this is going to sort of inform the foundation of your knowledge. And you can take this and tweak it. And I like to think about this section as analogous to cooking. All right, so I'm sure all of us love to eat. Most of us like to cook. If you like to cook, you're probably used to using a recipe. Or like maybe like me, you go off recipe, but you always start with an algorithm of basic ingredients, okay? And those 4 basic ingredients, if you are cooking compost, are brown things, green things, air, and water. All right, brown stuff, green stuff, air, and water. And we're gonna dive into each of those. But if you don't remember anything else about this presentation today, I would encourage you to remember those 4 things. Because usually if you have a problem, there's something off with one of those or 2 of those elements, those factors. And if everything's going great, then you've probably adjusted everything just beautifully with those 4 things, okay? So brown stuff, green stuff, air, and water. Let's talk about the brown stuff. That's represented by carbon. Now, we have carbon sources all around us outside, especially in the fall. Leaves, pine needles, dried plants, hay, wood chips or mulch, even shredded paper. That's a picture on the right-hand side of my shredder at home. Those are all carbon sources. Even the paper cardboard, not paper, cardboard, the paper sacks that you get your groceries in are considered a carbon source. And in fact, I think I shredded up a Whole Foods bag there. Carbon is the single most largest amount of mass item that you want to have in your compost. And we'll talk about saving leaves in a minute, but some of you may be a little bit like me, a little crazy, and your neighbors know that you're gonna go pick up whatever bagged carbon items are out on their curb to not go to bulk and brush. Because I actually personally like to store some of those things in my side yard, because I know that during the wet growing season, there's going to be a shortage of carbon items. So I always stockpile some leaves and a couple of bales of hay in my side yard for making compost throughout the year, because you are going to need a lot of carbon. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, so the first thing was carbon or brown things. The second ingredient in making compost is nitrogen, and that's the green stuff. Now, obviously, right now we have a lot of green stuff outside. You're mowing your grass, you've got grass clippings, fresh living plants, food scraps are nitrogen items. Now, manure and coffee grinds, even those are technically brown, those are actually nitrogen sources. On the right-hand side here is a picture of a bucket from our Turns residential program. And of course, you can see it's beautifully uncooked, but probably still edible produce that we compost in our program. And if you're not doing this at home, composting your food scraps, I would encourage you to do that. In summary, nitrogen is the second ingredient that goes into your compost. Let's talk a little bit more in detail right now about the food scraps. If you're going to start composting at home, outside, there's kind of a general do's and don'ts list. And just so take a look at this for a second. Everything on the top, of course, is yes. The things on the bottoms are no. Generally, you want to stay away from meats and dairies, fats and oils, a lot of liquids, pet feces. Those things can both create odor and also attract unwanted visitors. We'll talk about some ways and methodologies at the end that you can compost some of these items if you really want to compost everything. There are some ways that you can do that, but generally speaking, if you're going to be composting outside in your urban area, you're going to want to avoid those things in the bottom. All right. So we talked about the brown things, the carbon sources, green things, nitrogen, now water. All right. Water is important for all forms of life to live. You know, you saw the soil food web and all that activity happening there. It's really important that all that activity has moisture to continue to live. So whenever you are adding those brown things and those green things, I would encourage you to add just a light layer of water. You know, you want your compost to be like a moist sponge, but you don't want it to be like a wet, sopping wet towel. There is an industry standard for moisture content, and it's typically 45 to 60% moisture ratio if you're at a commercial composting facility. So when you're thinking about composting, if you haven't started yet, be sure that if you're doing like a heap layer or something outside, you have access to a water source. And that's very important for us in our summer Texas heat as well, is to keep that compost moist. All right, the last ingredient is air, oxygen. Now, I mentioned this before, you can toggle these 4 ingredients in certain ways to make compost happen faster or slower. Generally speaking, the more that you turn your compost, the more oxygen you're adding to it, and that will speed up the decomposition process. Another thing you can do to make your compost cook faster, going back to our recipe analogy, is to make the materials smaller that are going into it. And that's adding more surface area to those materials. So if you just have a lot of time on your hands and want to get just super fast compost, and you, I would encourage you to buy something like a leaf shredder, okay, from Home Depot, and you're going to grind up your leaves, and that's going to make the compost cook faster. If you have a few extra minutes when you're chopping up your veggies and you're discarding of something for your compost, if you have an extra minute to chop up that broccoli stem or whatever it is, that's going to help your compost go faster. All right. Another important part of having a well oxygenated compost situation is that it's going to reduce odors, which if you like your neighbors and you want your neighbors to like you and have a good relationship, be sure that you have an oxygenated compost pile. All right. So we talked about brown stuff, carbon, green stuff, nitrogen, water, and air. Those are the 4 main things. Let's talk about the quantity and quality of those ingredients. There is something to be said for the size of the space that you're starting with. And ideally, you want to have somewhere around 3 to 4 feet square of materials to start. It can be less, but generally speaking, that is a starting point in which you have a mass of materials to get the heat going. And the heat is the fungi and the bacteria that's creating all of that activity within your compost. All right. If you can mix those things, that's great. We'll talk about ways that's like the super lazy way, you don't do anything to it. And then the more active style of composting, mix them if you can. Please always try to water a layer just quickly with your sprinkler hose or whatever after you do it. Very most important point about this is there is a thing called the CN ratio, or the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that has to do with the quantity of brown items that you have to the quantity of green items. And generally speaking, you want to have as many brown items as there, or as much as you can. That CN ratio is 30 parts to 1. So 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, which is kind of astounding, right? And I think that's where a lot of people, at least in the classes that I have taught and what I've learned personally, is one of the common mistakes when you're composting at home is not having enough brown stuff to your compost, which is why you should be a little bit crazy like me and maybe borrow leaves from your neighbors if they put them out, okay? Put them somewhere that nobody can seize them, but you do want to keep adding as much brown material as you can throughout the year. So again, that CN ratio is going to greatly affect decomposition. Okay, I hope y'all are still with me. Now, let's talk quickly about temperature. Generally speaking, the higher the temperatures, the faster your compost is going to break down. somewhere in the 140 to 150 Fahrenheit range is ideal. You know, at commercial facilities, of course, they're logging temperatures daily of the different piles, and that will also affect like maturity and stability. Now, if it gets too hot, that's actually a bad thing because not only could it combust, but you're also going to kill off that bacteria that's helping to break everything down. So anything above 160 degrees is too hot, and the rate of composting will slow. Now, a lot of people ask about composting weeds and flower seeds and things like that. Those things will be killed above 131 degrees on average. You can compost, you can measure your compost with a thermometer, but you don't have to. I actually don't do that at home. But if you really want to get into the science of it, you can buy a simple thermometer at your local hardware store and measure it. We measure our piles at turn, but if you're doing it at home, we're going to talk about some sort of basic ways that you can assess maturity. Okay, when is compost ready? Again, I'm a pragmatist, so I'm not going to try to sell you on any fancy, things. I like to encourage you to think about your 5 senses. And again, going back to the cooking analogy, what does the compost smell like? Does it smell earthy? What does it look like? Is it dark brown in color? What does it feel like? Is it loose and crumbly in texture? It should also be 1/3 of its original mass, generally speaking. And I'll show you a picture in a minute of how that works. The timeliness of your compost being ready all depends on those combination of 4 ingredients that I talked about and how you're toggling those factors. You could also get a lab test, but it's not necessary. At my business Turn, we get our soil, our compost tested with Texas A&M Soil Laboratory, and we look at the pH and things like that, and the NPKs ratios. And there, you can also have different compost maturity tests done, but it's really not necessary if you're at home. I would just encourage you, if you're just getting out on this, to get going and not worry about lab testing. But there are some general factors, like you can see right here, for assessing readiness of compost. And there are the 5 senses. And here on the right-hand side is some of our finished compost, actually with Turn. So this is where I'd like to pause. Actually, never mind. I'm going to do this real quickly. Compost applications. So this is the question of where can you put your compost, okay? And I like to turn the head on that coin and say, well, where can you not put compost? There's actually nothing that is not benefited by compost. You can mix it into your existing soil for new plants or old plants, into new growing mediums. If you like to grow seeds, you can mix it into your perlite or some other seed growing mixture. Obviously, because it has so many qualities of retaining moisture, you can even use it as a mulch. You can apply it onto your sod or your turf or your grass. Just be careful to not do that when temperatures are too cold or too hot. And the other important factor here is that you want to be sure that you've aerated your turf first, either with soccer cleats or some sort of technical aeration device. And that is because if you put compost on turf that has not been aerated, it's going to create a thatching effect, like a big tangled ball mess. And that is what this picture is about, is because, again, I'm a native Texan and I love our state, but I know we love our grass and the perfection of our grass. And we will pay a lot of money for soil treatments and providers to come treat our grass. Compost has amazing powers for your turf grass. And, just in a fine layer, you can really inoculate your soil and get things going again under your grass. On the left-hand side is a picture from my property, and what you'll see in the front is what that grass usually looks like. We were doing a big landscaping project and actually had a truck bed of gorgeous mushroom compost delivered, and it sat in a pile for a couple of months. I wasn't able to produce enough compost for the project, so I paid to have a dump truck dump it. And that big gorgeous green grassy patch right there is where the compost sat for a month or two, and look at what happened compared to the rest of the yard. So it does have powerful applications even for grass. Now, this is where I'm going to pause and take any questions about the science or the why or applications or readiness.
All right. So our first question, Lauren, is if I don't have enough of my homemade compost, can I use peat moss or add some peat moss to make it go a little bit further?
Do you mean to make more compost, or?
I guess it's to supplement it if you don't have enough. Is that what you meant?
Well, I think if you're asking if peat moss has the same attributes as compost, it doesn't, but you can add peat moss to your compost. So peat moss would be an ingredient in adding to your compost, but it wouldn't be like extending your compost, if that's the question.
All right, so it'd just be like another supplement to add to your soil.
Yes.
And also, this person bought a bag of organic stuff called compost starter. Is that worth the money? They haven't used it yet, and if they do use it, what's the most effective way to use the compost starter?
That's a great question, and something I didn't cover. Sometimes I talk about it, but you can buy, that's called an inoculant, and it's basically all of the things that you saw on the Soil Food Web in a very small distilled quantity. And you can add that if you're wanting to start your compost. Another thing you can do is just get a teaspoon or two of finished compost from a neighbor. It'll do just the same trick. It's just importing, if you will, the millions and millions of bacteria and fungi that are in the soil to get things moving, to turn on the oven, if you will. So in order to use it, I don't know exactly what brands you have. Just follow the directions in the back. There's also things like compost molasses. There's a lot of different types of inoculants. So just follow the directions in the back. Now that you've already got it, that's great. But for those of you who haven't bought something like that, if you have a friend who already has a compost pile, you can just, get out a quarter of a cup or whatever. And that should do the same thing. That's a great question.
Awesome. And someone has a compost, their compost bed has a big ant bed in it right now due to the rain. How do they control the ants in that without harming their compost?
Yes, so that's a great question. And I wanted to make a point earlier that I didn't make it, and that is if you don't see bugs out in your soil and your compost, something is wrong, okay? Our soil is meant to be full of life, and as you saw in the Soil Food Web. So some people say to me, oh my gosh, there's roaches out in my compost, or oh my God, there's XYZ. That's a good thing, okay? Now, I actually have, and one of the things I'll show you, I do have ants in my compost, and I let them stay. They are breaking things down. They're moving around. There's other bugs in there. I'm sure at the time of harvest, you're probably concerned about what might happen. And I don't know what methodology you're using, so I can't really speak to that. But I would never use chemicals on anything in my compost, not to kill the bugs, not to kill any of that biological activity that's happening. So at the time that you're about to harvest, if you're really worried about those guys being like fire ants or something, this is me, I would go old school and like boil some hot water or something like that, or wear some gloves. But for my sake, I don't worry about the bugs or even ants that are in my compost. But that also might, and you can message me directly because I'd love to know like how big you're talking about, how big is the ant pile, like how big is your situation there. That's all a little bit relative.
All right. And someone wants to know if they can use one of those non-touch thermometers to check their compost temperature. I guess one of the infrared, that have become very popular in the past year.
Yes, like the ambient temperature things. I mean, I don't know about that actually. That's a good question. To me, that doesn't, I'd have to look that up because it depends again on what methodology you're using. If you have like a sort of a chicken wire, like 5 or 6 feet tall thing, and you're only measuring the external temperature, you're not really getting the internal temperature. And so it kind of depends on the, I would say, the structure and the mass of what you're doing. But I've never heard about that for compost. At like compost facilities, there's usually like a probe, and you measure different parts of the pile. And if there's in sort of ambient temperature thing, it's a very, very expensive, like $1,000 machine. So I'll have to check up on that for urban household use. That's a great question. I'm going to make a note to look that up.
All right. Let's see. So someone missed when you're talking about green stuff. They didn't get this. There's a section under bread, grains, and pasta. Was it beans or nuts? Is that what the other one under that was? Okay. All right. So yes, it was beans and nuts. And what's the best setup to keep the 3x3 foot compost aerated? Should they cover it? Are those rotating tumbler compost containers any good? What's the ideal, I guess, setup for a 3x3?
Yes, great question. And that's going to be covered in the next section.
Okay.
Section.
Right.
Sorry. The methodologies. I'm going to show you guys like different ways of doing this and just kind of give you like a menu, if you will. Going back to the food analogies, the menu of things you can try at home.
All right. So someone has an old bag of coffee grounds. Should they mix it into the compost, or can they just put it in a potted plant or tree or toss it in the garden, or do they need to compost that first? The coffee grounds.
If you have a compost pile, I would suggest that you compost them because coffee grinds are, it's a pure nitrogen source. So that's the ideal. And so you have to be careful if you're talking about house plants, like how much you're just putting directly onto your plants. So again, I'm sorry, I'm not being very specific. It's kind of a relative question. I would always suggest composting something instead of just putting a pure source directly onto a plant, unless you know for sure that that plant is like low on nitrogen or that plant is low on some other nutrient. It's always best to combine all those ingredients into that rainbow of macro and micronutrients and then apply that finished product onto your plants. So I would say compost it if you can.
Okay, and I misunderstood. So they're coffee grounds that are not been used. So I guess they just expired or whatever. So they haven't been used. That's still okay to put in your compost pile, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, expired anything is fine. Expired herbs. I mean, anything that's food expired, that's where it should be going, not into your garbage can. You should be composting it for sure. That's a great question.
All right. And then someone commented that they put food grade diatomaceous earth in the compost pile to get rid of ants, but maybe they should have just left them there. Their husband hates insects, though, so that's why they did that.
Yeah. I mean, I have chickens in our yard, and I love food grade diatomaceous earth for their beds, but I wouldn't put that in my compost pile. But since you've done it already, it's probably going to be fine. Like, again, depending on how big the compost is and how much mass is going there, it might have just gotten a few of them. I probably didn't nuke the whole pile, so I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Awesome. All right, so that's all the questions we have so far.
All right, great. Thanks, Vanessa. Oh, it's 12:40. All right, we got to get going. Now, this is the good stuff, y'all. And this is the different ways that you can compost at home. And we're going to start with the most obvious and then gradually get to the most fringy and even the more disgusting methods, okay? So bear with me. The first one is called walkway composting. And this seems so obvious, but think about the forest floor, right? You don't see the National Forest Service or Park Service importing compost to the forest because nature does this work on its own. And you can do this in your urban landscape by simply putting those leaves or those branches in walkways or areas where you might walk, and walking over them through 1 or 2 growing seasons is going to basically crush, decompress those things, and your feet are going to start doing the work. And then you can put those more decomposed materials back into your growing space. Excuse me, I do this in my side yard because I have a little fence that goes from my front to my backyard and a big oak tree there. And so I get a ton of leaves, and I always just keep them there and then walk on them. And then I scoop them over on top of my oak leaf hydrangeas and some other plants there and ferns. And it's just creating another organic layer. So this is called walkway composting. Seems very obvious, but it is a legitimate methodology. All right, sheet composting. This is another thing you can do. I do this at home. Some people call it the lasagna method, which means just adding different organic layers to your garden. This is my vegetable garden in my backyard a couple of seasons ago. And if I'm feeling super lazy, when it's starting to get really cold, I just add a layer of leaves there. There's some branches. There's a little dried flower arrangement at the bottom. All you're doing is adding another organic layer to your soil that's going to foster those microorganisms and give them more food to eat. Now, ideally, it would be great if you could shred those things up. I understand that. But in the springtime, if you add some more topsoil on it and some compost, even so a little bit more finished compost, you're just going to add more and more organic matter to your soil. This is called sheet composting. This is kind of looks like gross right now in the winter time, but this is my vegetable bed, one of them in the backyard in late spring, early summer. And as you can see, like nobody really cares what happened in the winter time, okay? Right now the plants are loving it, all right? So that's called sheet composting. Compost pockets is a way that you can also dispose of your food scraps. This is actually a methodology I learned from Texas A&M AgriLife in the Master Composting Program. I was sort of like, really? Just dig a hole and bury it? But yes, you can. Now, the important thing about this is that you want to dig a hole that is at least 12 to 18 inches deep. You're just adding a food source to the soil, to the microbes, to the worms, and you're just adding some more organic matter to the roots of your plants. I have some peach trees in my backyard. I've done this several times in different places around them because they grow so crazily fast in the early spring. I will say, be sure you make the hole deep enough because I've learned the hard way. We have a really frisky little Cocker Spaniel who's an excellent nose. If you don't bury those scraps deep enough, you're bound to attract either your pet or something else to come find them. So word to the wise on compost pocket. Now, we were talking about the amounts of materials and mass and decomposition. The old school way of composting is called the heat method. This is what I learned from my grandmother, what she did in her backyard. She just had slow static piles, and those are what you see in the left-hand side here. This is one of our community composting facilities where there's dried grass, there's food scraps, there's mulch. You can see the steam coming from the top of the pile, and those are turned very occasionally, not very often, and you will have finished compost in about 6 to 7 months-ish using this method. Now, the right-hand side is the faster method. It's called windrow method, and that's actually called a windrow machine, which is what commercial facilities use. Very expensive piece of machinery that just continually turns these rows of compost and their aisles in between. And in that method, you can have finished compost in about 3 to 4 months. All right. So the container method is probably what we all think about doing at home. And it's probably what I would encourage you to use at home if you're just getting started. And so there are so many different ways you can do this. Creativity is your friend. It's very relative to what situation you have at home. That's me on the left-hand side at US Composting Council training, where we just constructed with some simple hardware fence material, our own piles. In fact, we had a competition about what recipe different teams would use and how hot the temperatures we could get in a week. If you see the third image there, you can get some pallets. You can upcycle and create your own, 3-compartment wooden bin. The last image there is a tumbler, which is really popular with a lot of like hardware stores will try to sell it to you. And there are pluses and minuses to all of these. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. That right-hand side one is my tumbler. I do use it at home for certain things because sometimes I just have too much organic materials. So it is a valid method. I'm not a huge fan of that because I can't always see how much moisture is in there and also how much air it's getting. And the other thing about a tumbler is the more you put in there and the more compost you make, just remember you've got to get that out of there, and it can be quite heavy and uncomfortable at the end. So pluses and minuses to all of these. This is probably my favorite. Somebody asked about the 3 to 4 square foot container. This is a 4-sided called Shepherd's Bin. And I think I got this at Ace Hardware for like $40 or $50, or maybe Tractor Supply. And I love this one because the corners, they're metal, and you can take 1 or 2 out, and then you can just take off one side, scoop out some of that finished compost from the bottom, and then put it back together. It also makes it easier to mix it up. This is a little funny side note. Last summer, I grew this, the compost bin produced the most amazing acorn squash plant from the compost as a little surprise. And we had like 4 acorn squash. And of course, my family ate them. So though I've never been able to successfully grow acorn squash, my compost did. And that is why that plant is growing out there. And I just let it go because I was like, something's going to happen here. And sure enough, this is the same bin. And this is after the massive snowstorm that we had in February. And you can see I just keep layering organic things there. I don't really turn this one very often. It just keeps sinking down. Point of this picture is look at all the dry space around it and on top of it. Even in the midst of the storm, this thing was still producing so much heat and so much biological activity that it was often dry, even those freezing temps. All right, here's another DIY container method. I did this at home. Everybody on my team, my family knows I am not a very handy person. I can barely parallel park my car, but I was able to construct this thing using some hardwire from Ace Hardware again, and some basic clippers. And I just took the roll apart and then snipped it and then bound it together. And this is where I keep my leaves. I collect them because there's too many, and I just keep putting the leaves in there, and there's some hay in there for my chicken coop. Sometimes I'll bury food scraps right in the middle. And what's cool about this is the worms have come all the way up from the bottom of this because it's right under the soil, and they just are basically having a big party inside, just a massive fiesta. And in fact, when I go out there now, I scrape the top of that because this is from last year. There's a ton of worms in there, and it's pretty cool because they came all the way up from the soil to eat inside of there. When I took my master composting course from Texas A&M, I was told that this method would produce a compost cake over, the period of a year or two, and I was really fascinated by that. So the idea is that even though you're not doing anything, you're just adding stuff and water and letting it sink down over the right amount of time, you're going to produce finished compost. And I was sort of like, pretty skeptical. So I had to try it. And sure enough, last fall, I tipped this guy over and I unhooked the sides, and within it was this gorgeous, gorgeous finished compost. And so I scooped it out in my wheelbarrow, and it's all over my yard now. And I just started the whole process all over again. So they were right. And this is the finished compost cake from a very simple construction. This picture I like to show because after I taught this class, somebody sent us an image of a sleek, I think she was an engineer or her husband was an architect, one or the other, compost bin that they made outside. It's triangular, modern one. It's so beautiful compared to the one that I just showed you guys, right? All is to say, please be creative and use the materials that you have. All right. So Oogle culture is wonderful, under appreciated, not very widely known method of composting that's very important. And the idea with this is that you put together pieces of decaying wood in approximately the right structure, and you'll see over on the left-hand side the way in which you want to stack these things. This decaying wood over time is going to just release moisture and nutrients. That's going to actually create a growing space if you want for plants. The middle picture are some huge vegetable beds made out of this decaying wood. Think about all the storms that we've had over the past few years and all the wood that gets thrown out. Probably even your own yard, you have your trees trimmed. There's a way to recycle those items and compost them. And by them composting, they're actually going to create a growing space. This is a tenet of permaculture, if any of you are interested in permaculture. On the right-hand side of this, you guys, I've made the basis for an oogle bed, again, at my house. There were a couple of Christmas trees in the bottom. There were a bunch of rotting limbs, and I just kept stacking these materials, and every year I keep stacking on it. And the right-hand side here is what's now a vegetable bed. Have a lot of mint and okra and a ton of things growing there. And I just continually, every season, we get more leaves, I put it on the oogle bed. You know, get a little bag of mulch or have some left over, I just put it on there. I'm just adding to it. And right now it's a beautiful, beautiful growing bed. I need to update the pictures there. Okay. For those of you folks who live in an apartment and you don't have a yard, I would highly recommend checking out vermicomposting. And the idea with this is that you're using worms to do all the hard work. And there are particular types of worms that you'll want to use. You can't just grab any worms from your yard. The idea here is that these worms are going to be eating your food scraps and your paper and these materials, and their excrement or their castings are going to create a valuable soil amendment called worm castings. You can do it very simply with a Rubbermaid bin, like you see in the middle, drill some holes in the side. For the oxygen, get some shredded newspaper to start. You can get some worms online on Amazon for $15 to $20 to get the red wigglers, the right kind of composting worms. Or you can do a little bit more fancy and get a worm tray system on the right-hand side. That'll be around 60 to 80 to 100 bucks. But this is such a cool methodology because not only are you reducing waste, but you're actually creating this really amazing product for your household use and the worm castings. There is a local business. She's a good friend of mine called Heather Rinaldi. The business is called Texas Worm Ranch, and she is the queen, one of our nation's leading experts on vermicomposting. She has classes all the time about this. So here's her website. Check it out if you're interested. Bokashi method is a way that you can compost everything. If you want to compost your pizza, your chicken, meat, stearias, oils, it's an anaerobic method. You can buy the brand online. And what happens with this is it's a brand that chemically breaks down all of this organic material so that you can put it back into your soil after 2 weeks. I have tried this at home. I don't do it now, but I have tried it in the past. It does work. And so I would encourage you to check this out if you're interested in doing everything, composting all of your food scraps at home. We're running out of time. So last but not least, black soldier flies. BSFs. I promised you that I would end with the most disgusting, but it's actually the most fascinating. These guys will eat everything. If you want your mind blown, look at like black soldier flies on YouTube eating McDonald's cheeseburger or something. I mean, they eat so much and so quickly, and they love fatty foods. So again, this is a way to compost all of your food waste. Chances are, if you have a bin at home or a tumbler, they're actually already in there. This is a bin that I have that I ordered. It's called a BioPod, and I put the meats and the fatty foods in there, and then the black soldier flies go to it. They lay their larvae. The larvae pupate, and they try to come out and crawl out. And then when they crawl out, they become a protein source for my chickens. So there's a lot of research being done right now of black soldier flies as not only a waste reduction tool, but a way to provide feed for animals. So in my side yard is both the circle of life and the circular economy all at once with these guys. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Just some final thoughts. I hope I haven't disgusted you. I hope you're interested. The point of this is to just give you a lot of options, and I hope you'll get started doing one of them. There's so much information online about any one of these methodologies. So check out all the research out there. Be creative. You're going to learn as you go. You're going to make mistakes. That's all right. Just get going and try to use everything in your urban natural space. Your leaves are not trash. Your leaves are a resource. That hay bale from Halloween, that shouldn't be trashed. That's a resource. Your coffee grinds, your eggshells, your food scraps, those are resources. They aren't trash. So thank you all so much. I'm going to stop there for any more questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Laura. Yeah, that's the black fly larva. That's fascinating. I'm gonna have to look into that some more. I don't have chickens though to eat them, but yeah, I'm sure the birds and the local birds would probably love to eat those.
Yeah.
Someone has 2 very large live oaks in their yard, and the leaves seem to last an eternity. They use a composting lawnmower, but the leaves really pile up in their flower beds, which obviously don't get mowed. What should they do? Could they add some of the compost starter there and just kind of compost them in place, kind of like you talked about the pathway composting, or?
Yeah, so if I'm hearing correctly, you're mowing over the oak leaves, but it's still not breaking them down small enough.
So they're accumulating in the flower beds.
Oh, okay. I see. Yeah, I mean, if there's a way that you could break them down smaller, that would be great. I don't think there's necessarily a problem with their being there unless you're worried about aesthetics. I wouldn't necessarily add directly an inoculant just on top of the leaves, but I don't also see the harm in that. So I'm not sure if the concern is more aesthetics or if it's actually doing any good.
All right. And someone has lots of worms in their compost. And after talking about vermiculture, I'm guessing they're assuming it's beneficial to assist with the breaking down of materials to have those worms in your compost.
Oh yes, they're worms, pill bugs. You should see a lot of bugs in your compost, and that's fabulous. It's a wonderful sign.
And someone commented that the slow method is also called like cold composting as well. Cold composting is another term.
There's lots of different terms. I guess there's cold and hot and slow and fast and static, windrow. So cold is it's not actually cold, but it just means it's not the fast way, it's the slower way.
All right. And someone has small, weird looking, and they put this in quote, worms that are short with lots of legs in their compost, and they just left them. And someone else suggested that they might be millipedes, perhaps, that are in their compost. I'm assuming you said most organisms you see in there are beneficial. Those aren't hurting anything, then, right? Okay.
Not hurting anything. That's all good. It's all good.
Right.
I mean, you don't really want a hornet's nest in your compost, right? Probably for your personal protection, but those are all good things. I have all those in my compost.
Perfect. And it looks like squash growing out of compost is a common theme. We had several people commenting about their squash that have grown from someone grew butternut squash, and someone had a huge tomato plant that grew out of their compost pile.
See, there's
And-
added benefits, right? We didn't even talk about that. I should add that to the Y list. Little
There was-
volunteer plants.
Right. Someone had a squash that they didn't even grow that kind of squash or eat that kind of squash growing from their compost. So
Yeah, I always just, whatever starts growing, I just let it grow because I'm always curious to see what it's going to turn into. Why not?
and then someone else, how long does it typically take for to do the hugelkultur here in Dallas? Like how long does it take to break down to produce the soil? Usually, like how long does that process take?
That's a great question. And I always think of hugelkultur as actually a place to grow things. So if you're just using it simply as a composting method, it totally depends on the size of the inputs, like the size of are you using like massive oak tree branches? Are you using small stems? So it's totally relative to the type of what you're putting in and how much quantity you're putting in. But if you're just using it for compost, I would say, hey, put some mulch on there and some topsoil and start growing something.
All right. Let's see. Next one. I think this is relating to the vermiculture. They just bought worms at a fishing bait store with the red, the red wiggler worms. Are those okay to use, or do they need a different type of worm to do the vermicomposting?
Yes, there are particular vermicomposting worms. If you just got the fishing worms, those aren't red wigglers. Whenever I'm doing vermicomposting, and sometimes I do it seasonally off and on, I get red wigglers from Heather Rinaldi at Texas Worm Ranch. But all that being said, there are different types of composting worms. What you see in your soil are usually like Carolina jumpers, the fishing worms, it's not the same. So be sure you get the right ones.
All right.
Now, all that being said, put those worms back in your soil. I mean, it's going to be fine. But if you're doing vermicomposting specifically like indoors, you really do want to try to get the right worms.
All right. And someone commented that magnolia leaves are really tough. Will they break down in the compost?
They will. I don't know what your tree is like, but if you can mow over them and then rake that up, that would be wonderful. So again, the smaller the materials are before you put them in, the better results, faster results you'll have.
Right. Cool. And then going back to the oak leaves, should they try turning the leaves in their flower beds just to make them break down faster? Would that be beneficial to turn basically break them and turn them over and just leave them in their flower bed?
Sure, you could do. And, think about water too. I mean, I don't know what you have growing there, but just think about the other conditions that are there for breaking them down, Again, water, if you're turning it air, that makes sense to me. Yeah, that's like, I mean, this person who's asking, I'd love to know kind of like what the circumstances are. I also have two big, large oak trees in my front yard, and there's just a ton of leaves all the time, and I just keep turning them there, and I add mulch and I have flowers, and so it seems to be going okay, but I know it's a concern, so please feel free to email me.
All right. And if mushrooms start growing in the compost, does that mean it's too wet?
That's a great question. It doesn't mean that it's too wet. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. No, but just keep an eye on that, I would say. And again, it kind of depends on what like methodology you're using, because there's going to be fungi. That's a natural part of the process. In my tumbler, I see fungal things. So I would say keep an eye on it. In general, in Texas, we're going to have more problems with the compost being too dry than it is too wet. That's what worries me more, is if it's too dry. I worry less about compost that's too moist.
All right. And if someone got wood chips from a tree service, how long would it take to make a good compost from the wood chips?
It all depends on which method you're using. If you're just going to let it sit there in a heap and not do anything, it also, if you're not adding any green things, it's going to be slower, and it probably won't be as nutrient organic dense. It just depends on which method you're using. Like if you're just trying to make compost from that, or if you're adding the mulch and the wood chips on top of your space. I'd love to know just a little bit more about that. If you don't do anything to organic materials, it will break down in probably 6 months, like you saw those piles. If you're turning it and adding other things to it, it could be a few months. It depends.
It probably depends on how much rain we've gotten too, and that kind of thing. Like,
yes, remember the 4 main ingredients and toggle all those factors. It changes everything.
all right. And somebody commented that the mushrooms or the fungus in your compost probably help it break down faster because they've noticed that on a tree stump that has mushrooms growing on it, it's breaking down a lot faster than it was.
Makes sense to me. Yes.
All right, and this will probably be our last question here. Someone asked, can they add regular white paper towels and paper plates to a compost pile?
That's a great question. And yes, you can. We get a lot of questions about bleached paper towels and bleached, Kleenex and things like that. I would say, as in anything, it depends on what you're using your compost for. If you're using your compost for your vegetables that is going to feed your family, if I were you, I'd be really careful about what you put in there. If you're using it for some outdoor sort of general use landscaping plants, I would worry less about what you're inputting into it. For sure, you don't want to use paper towels that have any chemicals on them, cleaning products, or anything like that. But generally speaking, paper products, paper plates, and all of that, I am okay with doing it at home myself.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your amazing compost knowledge with us today. And like you said, do some research. And the library has a lot of books on composting too. Yeah, there's a lot of great resources out there. So thank you so much for joining us today, Lauren, and thank you for all of the people that spent their lunch break with us.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
We'll have another program, not this coming Monday for Memorial Day. We're skipping Memorial Day. And then our first one of June will be on gardens you can visit around Texas. So I think gardens, a great outdoor activity that you can do right now. And June will still be, hopefully, if we stay on trend, not quite as hot as June normally is. So a great time to go visit some gardens and get some ideas about using your own backyard and front yard. Right.
If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to email me. My email is lauren@turncompost.com. And I really appreciate, again, this opportunity by the Dallas Public Library and the City of Dallas. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thanks, everyone.